Early analytic philosophy begins with the ambition of identifying the canonical structure that really carries meaning. Russellian logical form, Carnapian intentional organization, the dream of a purified semantic pipeline. All of this assumes that beneath ordinary language there is a stable lever that explains inference, consequence, contradiction, and propositional identity. Then Quine arrives and partially inverts the achievement. He does not merely say, "We failed to find the lever," he destabilizes the very idea that there must be a uniquely identifiable semantic mechanism hidden underneath discourse. The analytic/synthetic distinction weakens. Synonymy becomes circular, translation becomes underdetermined, and theoretical terms become revisable within a web rather than anchored by fixed semantic cores. So what happens? The old canonical structure does not disappear. It mutates in ontological status. What had once been treated as the logical foundation of meaning becomes redescribed as a psychological hypothesis about cognition. This is the crucial historical curve. Logical form as the real structure of propositions. Quinean destabilization of privileged semantic foundations. Reappearance of structured propositional machinery inside the mind as empirical posit. Fodor's language of thought can therefore be read as a kind of post-Quinean rescue operation. After Quine, one can no longer confidently claim, "Here is the canonical semantic structure guaranteed by logic itself." But one can say, perhaps cognition works as if there were an internal combinatorial system producing models of logical consequence compatible with observable inferential regularities. The dream survives by changing jurisdiction.
If you follow this channel, you may have noticed that in recent weeks I have slowly shifted focus away from Quinean skepticism and returned to the excavation of certain foundationalist moments, especially Carnap. And this leads towards a fascinating, though perhaps not entirely original, a fascinating idea that much of the 20th century philosophy of language can be read as a strange voyage from anti-psychologism back into psychologism. And this happens not accidentally. This movement also reopened space for phenomenology and other historical approaches that understood the mind not merely as biological machinery, but as a layered formation of idealizations compatible with the scientific and propositional self-consciousness of an epoch.
The first theories of meaning weren't about language. They were about work. Specifically, why did mathematical language succeed in representing physical connections, where centuries of scholastic philosophy had only accumulated confusion? That was the trigger. Galileo's equations revealed structures that qualitative description had merely gestured at. Mathematics didn't describe nature differently. It made possible forms of understanding that previous frameworks could not achieve. From that observation, two philosophers drew a single hard line: Leibniz, Hume. A claim is either answerable to logic and mathematics or answerable to experience. If it answers to neither, it is probably nonsense. Nonsense wasn't a polite logical category. It was almost a moral verdict. Hume wasn't saying medieval talk on mystical qualities and angels are unlearnable or linguistically anomalous. He was saying they were a kind of intellectual pathology, a symptom of minds that had lost contact. Descartes understood this before anyone made it explicit. The drive toward mathematical language wasn't a preference, it was a recognition. The mind has something like a native grammar, an inner architecture that would hold even after everything else is cut by methodic skepticism. And mathematics spoke that structure more directly than ordinary language ever could. And here is what I think is not an accident. The questions that now sit quietly inside empirical research programs, what grammars the brain will refuse, what compositional structures earn collective consensus, what semiotic systems are learned most efficiently. These questions were first asked somewhere else entirely. They were asked by people trying to separate science from superstition, trying to identify what kind of claim a mind would have to grasp to avoid falling into nonsense. Trying to understand why mathematics succeeded where scholastic vocabulary failed. The parameters of today's empirical linguistics, the ones running inside neurology departments and psycholinguistics labs, were set by a philosophical program, and more precisely, a phenomenological one, because the horizon of intelligibility of a culture is also the horizon of its grammatical patterns. What a community can mean and what a community can say are not two separate questions wearing the same clothes. They were always one question.
What is a theory of meaning? Most people assume that a theory of meaning begins by explaining what words mean. It doesn't. It begins with a stranger. Someone speaks, they make assertions, deny things, correct themselves, react to evidence, distinguish serious claims from jokes, possibilities from absurdities. The first task is not to assign meanings to their words. The first task is to make them intelligible. To understand a speaker is to understand how their assertions fit together, what follows from what would count as a correction, what would force a revision, and where they locate the boundaries between the actual, the possible, the fictional, and the absurd. This is why theories of meaning so often appeal to truth or truth conditions. Truth and falsity are not merely labels attached to sentences. They are tools for reconstructing the inferential structure that makes a speaker intelligible. Meaning appears not as the beginning of the process, but at the end of it. It emerges once a sufficiently coherent pattern of commitments has been reconstructed. But understanding a speaker involves more than identifying what they take to be true. It requires understanding how finally they carve the space of possibilities. Some frameworks draw only crude distinctions between truth and error. Others distinguish ordinary mistakes from implausibilities, implausibilities from fictions, fictions from absurdities, and absurdities from outright contradictions. As an example, one person may think that changing the date on which Caesar crossed the Rubicon leaves history largely untouched. Another may regard the same change as altering the entire trajectory of Roman civilization. Most people would eventually draw the line somewhere near the claim that Rome was governed by dogs. But the important point is that these thresholds are not arbitrary. They reveal the inferential resources available within a framework. The more finally a framework can distinguish possibilities from impossibilities, the more intellectual work it can perform.
And this is why the most ambitious theories of meaning have often converged on a single aspiration. They seek the point at which what a framework can carry and what a framework can verify are brought into alignment. In classical terms, this aspiration appears as the search for the boundary between the analytic and the synthetic. Technical narratives about meaning often assume that this boundary must remain stable if we are to rank some forms of discourse as more meaningful, more informative, or more cognitively significant than others. Or, stated differently, they assume that the inferential consequences a framework allows us to draw must remain broadly harmonious with what we can ultimately justify, establish, or verify. You can see this assumption almost everywhere. In attempts to distinguish the aspects of language that genuinely contribute to learning from those that merely decorate discourse. In attempts to separate explanatory structure from metaphorical collage. In attempts to determine which components of scientific language carry the deepest explanatory burden: mathematics, observation, theoretical vocabulary, or ordinary language. This is why questions about meaning never remain merely linguistic. They quickly become questions about knowledge, science, rationality, and authority. And this is only a glimpse of why controversies about meaning sit beneath some of the most ambitious projects in both philosophy and science. If these issues interest you, my courses explore this story in much greater depth, not as a collection of historical episodes, but as one of the central intellectual dramas behind modern philosophy, science, and theories of meaning.
20th century philosophy of language emerged from a broader attempt to extend the reach of logic over cognitive activities that had traditionally been regarded as too rich, too context sensitive, or too conceptually sophisticated to be represented by the poor resources of logic alone, as logic was conceived. The background logic is supposed to represent only what's true, independent of content. So, how can it capture relations which seem to exist only because of how things happen to be connected in the world? This is the problem that broke Aristotelian logic. What is a relation? You see two things related, but what's the content of the relation? Do you actually grasp it? Or is it just a subjective association you are projecting? For Kant, this suggested that arithmetic depended on forms of mediation richer than those available to formal logic alone. To understand why 7 plus 5 must equal 12, one must perform a synthesis governed by relations of order, succession, and construction. These relations are not learned from experience, but neither are they reducible to conceptual analysis.
Gottlob Frege rejected this conclusion. The apparent need for intuition, he argued, arose only because logic had been conceived too narrowly. Rather than appealing to a special faculty of construction, Frege sought to expand the logical framework itself.
Arithmetic would then emerge from conceptual relations whose necessity could be articulated within logic. The project was revolutionary. To recover arithmetic, additional conceptual machinery must be introduced. Frege believed that this machinery could be added in a principled and purely logical way. Yet the very resources that allowed the framework to represent arithmetic also allowed it to represent increasingly complex totalities of concepts and extensions. What followed was the first great crisis of the analytic tradition. The attempt to secure arithmetic by enriching logic exposed tensions internal to the very framework designed to guarantee its necessity. The history that follows is in large part the history of philosophy learning from the consequences of that failure.
In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein offers one of the most influential criticisms of this strategy. Russell's theory of types appears to explain logical form by introducing additional principles governing what may and may not be said. But for Wittgenstein, this gets the order of explanation backwards. Logical form is not something that can itself be represented by a further proposition, nor is it a structure that requires external safeguards to protect it from misuse. A meaningful proposition already presupposes logical form if an expression genuinely succeeds in saying something. Then the conditions that make it combinable with other expressions are already in place. If those conditions are absent, we do not obtain a false proposition, nor even a proposition requiring repair. we obtain nonsense.
Carnap's move, the one Wittgenstein's picture of language doesn't anticipate, is the insight that languages are never innocent in the way a single shared logical form would require. Of course, Wittgenstein is right in thinking that whatever makes sense is already well formed and do not need more information to legitimize it against nonsense. But that does not rule out the fact that there is numerous ways of forming our grammar. For Carnap, a language is a choice. One can build different linguistic frameworks, each carrying its own criteria of identity, its own rules for what counts as the same object across contexts, its own boundary between what belongs to the system and what falls outside it. Different frameworks can embed different versions of identity, and they often do. Crucially, there is So we arrive at an unexpected result. In order to save analyticity from Kant's appeal to intuition, we progressively relocated its source, first to logic, then to linguistic frameworks. But once that relocation is complete, it becomes increasingly difficult to explain what distinguishes arithmetic from other highly entrenched forms of discourse. We bought analyticity at the cost of making it look less unique.
If you cannot explain how you got there, you don't really know. You have heard this, maybe you have said it. It just feels true. It's one of those things that does not need an argument. You just state it and people nod. And there are versions of it everywhere, like there is a difference between understanding something and just getting the right answer. Or memorizing is not the same thing as knowing. Or that one that shows up in every conversation about education, about intelligence, about what it even means to be a thoughtful person. You can't fake real comprehension. Right? There's supposed to be a difference between the person who genuinely gets it and the person who just got lucky or practiced enough or saw the problem enough times that the answer comes automatically. This isn't just a casual opinion people have, this is load-bearing. The entire educational system is built on this. The entire self-help industry, the entire idea of what authenticity even means. Being someone who actually understands their own life, their own choices, other than just running on autopilot. You could give this cluster of assumptions a name. I want to call it the transparency assumption, or maybe the auditability assumption. I'll come back to which one feels right. But the idea is, genuine understanding leaves a trail. When you truly know something, you can show your work. There is a recognizable, inspectable difference between arriving at a conclusion because you grasped it and arriving at the same conclusion because you have been exposed to it so many times, it just comes out automatically. And then the shock. AI systems, they produce outputs that look exactly like understanding, consistently, across domains, with no trail, no autobiography, no moment you could point and say, there, that's where the insight happened. Just the right answer again and again. And most people experience this as a technological surprise. Something new had shown up that violated rules we all implicitly agreed were in place. But here's what I find genuinely strange about this moment we are in. A philosopher had already been there, decades before any of these machines existed. Not thinking about machines at all, actually. He was thinking about a distinction that everyone around him was quietly using to keep the transparency assumption standing. His name was Willard van Orman Quine. And, okay, I need to say this in Portuguese because the English doesn't quite capture it. He was stupefato, stunned, not by a technological development, by the amount of philosophical weight one distinction was being asked to carry. The distinction between analytic and synthetic. That distinction sounds technical, but the idea is actually simple. There are things you know because you master a conceptual framework, because you understand what the words mean and you follow the relations between them. Classic example, bachelors are unmarried.